I've created the perfect D&D adventure. Now, all I have to do is run it for my players, and they'll finally realize that I am the greatest dungeon master they've ever seen. What could possibly go wrong? American General Douglas MacArthur once famously said, "No plan ever survives its first encounter with the enemy." But what Wikipedia won't tell you is that the General actually said this in the middle of his Thursday night game of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Mike Tyson, legendary boxer and closeted Pathfinder 1st Edition player, once coined the phrase, "Every dungeon master's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth by my level 13 human monk brother multi-class." Players are a necessary evil to run effective tabletop role-playing games. But unfortunately, not every player plays the way you want them to. We DMs like to label players into categories like the min-maxer or the storyteller. But looking back at all the games and campaigns I've ran, there were certain players who have taught me the most valuable lessons in engaging the different playstyles. And then there was Larry. We'll get to Larry later. But perhaps the various lessons I've learned from my players will be just as helpful for you as they were for me. Starting with Jake, my longest playing player. He has participated in nearly every game session I've ever ran. That's because we are bound by a blood pact. And Mom said we needed to bond more as brothers. But Jake was every shade of power gamer over the years. From casual optimizer to having 5 different class builds planned out from levels 1 through 20 waiting in the wings. Many players find their fun in problem solving within the game world. But most of Jake's enjoyment in those early games came from problem solving outside of the game table by comparing feats and class dips, whatever mechanical edge he could achieve within the rules of the game. At the table, he had his most fun when he saw the homework he did outside of the game pay off in-game. All I needed to do to give him that fun was to present a challenge that was the lock to his min-maxed key, in which Jake's key usually unlocked their death. But there was another lesson I learned early with Jake. When I started DMing my own campaigns, I wasn't afraid to dive right into homebrewing. Now, Jake wasn't opposed to house rules, especially if they made his character stronger. We were playing 1st edition of Pathfinder, and Jake asked, "Hey, can all these bow and crossbow abilities apply to guns as well?" And I said, "Sure, why not? Let's give it a try." And if you know why that was a bad idea for Pathfinder 1st Edition, tell everyone else in the comments below. Because like in Pathfinder, I would need at least 3 feats before I can do it adequately. Burn! The lesson I learned there was that a rule might look pointless on paper, but can make perfect sense when you're actually playing it at the table. The opposite can be true too, especially when you swipe rules from one game and cram them into another like I do, but don't be afraid to tinker. Just try the recipe at least once before adding in your own spices. But with all the lessons Jake taught me in my early DMing career, it was Jen who taught me the lesson I still have to remind myself every time I plan an adventure. I was running an online campaign of Tomb of Annihilation for 5th edition, which was also where I had my unfortunate experience with Larry. But Jen was a strong player, whose fun came from going deep into her character. She didn't use a character voice or try an accent. Rather, everything she did in the game was based on what her character believed. Not in a, "this is what my character would do" mentality. That was Larry. But her actions in the game were reflective on the backstory she created before the session. Jen did her backstory the right way. I was the one that screwed up. We discussed the character as GM and player, and she took the time to write this first-person's perspective journal entry on being a tiefling outcast. She gave me all sorts of material, from NPCs tied to her character to her character's wants and needs and why they needed to prove themselves in this campaign, and I did nothing with it. Or rather, I had something planned with all that ammo she gave me, but I was saving it for the right moment. Once the players get to here, then I'll reveal this epic twist using the mentor figure Jen wrote for her character. And once Jen's character reaches this level, then I'll sprinkle in some hints as to who her real father was. I waited for the right moment, like the good storyteller I wanted to be. And that moment never came, because Jen dropped out of the campaign. That's when I wrote this lesson in the front page of every DM notebook I own to remind myself before every game. If you have a good idea, use it now. You never know which game session will be your last. I'm sorry, Jen. I should have done better. But you got me back because you introduced me to Larry! Now, Chris was also part of that online Tomb of Annihilation campaign. There were a lot of lessons learned in that campaign because it was my first campaign entirely online. And Chris was quiet. Chris was reserved. With online play, it's easier for the more passive players to hide among the Discord chatter. I quickly learned you have to keep a turn order, even outside of combat, unless you want your players like Chris to be left in the dust. You're also more reliant on visuals like battle maps, but an aspect of online play I don't see others talk about is creating a visual anchor for online games. Something everyone can sort of stare at between the combat maps and rolling the virtual dice. Personally, I've used the animated versions of James RPG Art, the sponsor for today's video. James has been creating animated scenes for TTRPGs for years. I was using his renditions of Castle Ravenloft before he was cool. Now James has a massive collection of practically any fantasy scene you would need, especially to keep your virtual games visually immersive. Or you could just keep staring at your players awkwardly with their webcams.
Yeah, let's keep it faceless.
James is creating new scenes every month, so if you want the best bang for your buck, join James's RPG Art Patreon in the description below. But despite all the online tips and visuals I used to keep everyone immersed, I was convinced Chris would bail early in the game, because he never seemed to get a word in edgewise compared to the other players. Yet, Chris stayed for the entirety of that campaign, because his enjoyment of my game came from the social aspect of this hobby. He didn't have to be in the spotlight. He was just happy to be the guy who makes the sarcastic quip at the other players in his dry monotone. Chris is the type of player that you think is a problem you need to fix to make Chris's time more funner, but Chris taught me that if the players keep showing up, you must be doing at least something right. Bryce. Bryce was an enigma for a long time. Some of my favorite moments and most annoying arguments revolved around Bryce, at least until I met Larry. Bryce had some power gaming tendencies like Jake. He always leaned towards fighter types that could resort to caving in your skull if his convoluted plan A didn't pan out. He was a bit of a storyteller like Jen, but he wasn't so much interested in the story of his character so much as he was interested in the story of the game. And I'm not talking about my plot either. I'm talking about what I like to call the fish story. The story you tell after the game, like those RPG green texts like Sir Barrington, a bear character who put so much skills into deception and disguise that everyone believed this growling bear in a suit and monocle was a nobleman. Bryce would read those green texts like they were his guiding star. Bryce's fun was by doing something interesting, not optimal. Not even necessarily in character, but interesting. Bryce was an instigator. And if I was to put a big red button with the words, "Button that ends the world, do not push," Bryce would push that button before I'd even finish the sentence. That's a shit, you know. But you as a DM want players like Bryce in your games. If you have a whole group of Bryces, most of your prep ain't going to waste. You'll spend most of your planning figuring out the consequences to their actions. The problem with players like Bryce can come from mixing him with other types of players. Optimizers get annoyed when Bryce tries some convoluted plan that involves dropping a tower on the monster, instead of just making an attack roll. The storyteller can shut down when Bryce decides that it'd be way more interesting if they held the rescued NPC as ransom instead of taking her back to her father, the king. Players like Bryce win the most likely to convert to murder hoboism award when they feel like you're not providing enough interesting choices. But sometimes you need to reel in Bryce's shenanigans if his fun steps on everyone else's fun. Players like Bryce require the most work to make them the best versions of themselves. And that involves having a private conversation. You know, those one-on-one conversations that would solve 99% of r/RPG horror stories problems. You don't have to make them feel like you're a school principal correcting a student. It can be as casual as, "Hey, Bryce, love having you around, but can you not be such a Larry?" One lesson I learned is that you can instead direct consequences, both good and bad, back towards the instigator rather than the whole party. Instead of putting a button that explodes the whole world in front of Bryce, you put a button that explodes the player who pushed it. However, the last thing you want to do is punish the instigator so much that they stop instigating. Why does God give me his toughest battles? Why did he give me Larry? Larry is what can happen when players start inviting friends of their friends. Sometimes you get a great player and a new friend you never meet otherwise. Other times you get Larry. Larry was part of that Tomb of Annihilation campaign, and the problem I had with Larry is that he was that guy. That guy comes in many different flavors, most of which look like the Dark Link version of Jake, Jen, Chris, or Bryce. The Power Gaming Rules lawyer who will filibuster you into a corner when it only benefits themselves. The Wang Rod who defaults to, "It's what my character would do," when they screw over the rest of the party. The Shiptit who takes up so much of the spotlight, even Chris starts to feel sidelined. Or the Murder Hobo who will treat your games like their 6th playthrough of Baldur's Gate 3 if you don't jingle the keys in front of them every 5 seconds. Any player can have moments of that guy-isms, but what makes that guy is that guy has a track record of being that guy. When there's the off chance they can't attend, it's like a weight's been lifted from the group. Except that guy almost never misses a game. They also have a tendency to veer towards the chaotic creepy alignment. For Larry, it was little quips like, "Oh, sorry I was late, deficient. I was just watching corn." I'm not talking about the vegetable. Or sharing his homebrewed bard subclass, the courtesan, who gets special bonuses based on doing things. Instincts told me I should probably have let him go. Or at least level with him that, hey, I'm a PG-13 sort of DM. We don't do that here. But the problem with that guy is if unaddressed, they will eventually cause a fallout with either you or your fellow players. What Larry did in Tomb of Annihilation will always leave me a little bitter. I would rather play with the most min-max power gamers or players that'll straight up fudge their dice rolls than play with someone like Larry, who read the Tomb of Annihilation as I was running it! I didn't catch on until days later, but the final dungeon in Tomb is riddled with traps that have a specific way of circumventing them. All of which Larry seemed to just happen to describe with the exact phrasing as it's written in the book. That was when I learned a difficult but necessary lesson. As a dungeon master, you should accommodate anyone, but not everyone. I want to be welcoming to anyone who shows an interest in my games and this hobby. But not everyone is going to be a good fit for me and my group. Sometimes, it's just a clash of personalities or preferences to how we play these games. Other times, it's just because you're Larry. But what about you? Which of your own players did you learn the hardest lessons from? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to hear my best tips for preparing great games for your players, I'll show you right here in this video.